You guys are gonna, thank you. You guys are gonna get drunk tonight. One of my demos tonight involves a lot of Tor. All right, so what we're gonna do today is I'm gonna have a little bit of an egotistical moment, talk a little bit about myself while people are filing in. We'll talk a little bit about FreeBSD, what it is, and why it's not Linux and why you should care. And then we'll talk a little bit about libhijack, a post-exploitation runtime process infection tool for FreeBSD. And then we'll talk about the mandatory access control framework. We'll talk about MAC Rootkits, and we'll do a demo. So today's demo is the most complicated demo that I've ever done. I've sacrificed the required 3 3/4 goats to the demo gods, so let's hope that that works. So a little bit about me. I'm an offensive and defensive security researcher and engineer. Been in the field for around 15 years on and off, and human rights really matters to me. Being able to have free speech and freedom of thought is something that's close to my heart. And so as part of that, I run a high bandwidth Tor relay at home. It's a non-exit relay because I don't want feds knocking on my door, especially since I'm the co-founder of HardenedBSD, and I have some of HardenedBSD's infrastructure out of my home, like the package building server. I'm an open source enthusiast and advocate. I owe my whole career, my entire life, to open source. Because of the generosity of others, I've been able to establish a career. I flunked out of college and studied open source and learned how to code through the generosity of others. So thank you. I consider myself a noob. I like to learn new things, and I find that if I'm not learning at least one new thing a day, I kind of feel like I'm failing myself. So a little bit about FreeBSD. FreeBSD is a Unix-like operating system. We say Unix-like instead of Unix because of a lawsuit back in the early 90s, but it has its roots directly with Unix. Might have heard of a few companies that use FreeBSD heavily. Netflix, Juniper, Sony, Cisco, Dell, EMC, ASLR. Netflix's Open Connect appliances, they're big servers that get installed in internet exchange points around the world. Those Open Connect appliances deliver your streaming video content. And last time Netcraft ran a survey, they estimated around 36% of all peak North American internet traffic is delivered by Netflix. And that's FreeBSD. Your PlayStation 4 at home runs FreeBSD. NetApp appliances run FreeBSD. Juniper's switches and routers. So FreeBSD is used a lot, especially in the corporate scene. The problem is that FreeBSD's security is lacking. FreeBSD has some great features like dtrace, jails, ZFS, but the exploit mitigations are lacking. They only have a stack cookie, which is pretty stupid. Because exploit authors today, they don't really care much about stack cookies, especially with today's techniques like ROP and JOP and SROP and all that fun stuff. They don't have ASLR, they don't have WXORX, or for your Windows folk, DEP, DEP, no CFI, no safe stack, so really, literally, the only thing that they have is a stack cookie. All system hardening options are disabled by default. And so if you're getting started in exploit authorship, in reverse engineering, or any offensive aspect of the InfoSec industry, FreeBSD really is a good system to learn on because you're in 1999 era of security. It's really easy to write copy and paste style mass exploitation exploits. I'm going to jump around to a few different topics, and right now I'm going to jump to the executable and linkable format, or ELF file format. Linux and FreeBSD and Solaris all use ELF. ELF describes how your program gets loaded. It tells the operating system where in memory to load the application. There are different headers within the ELF file format. The ELF header, main ELF header is required, and the process header, which tells the operating system at what addresses and with which permission bits to load your different parts of your application. The dynamic header is required in one case if your application is dynamically loaded, and you will not see it for statically compiled applications. Section headers are optional. When you strip a binary, you're stripping out the section headers. Now, when we want to talk about process infection, we want to talk about injecting arbitrary code and running that arbitrary code. There's a few techniques for doing that. You can overwrite a part of the process's address space that is executable. The problem is that when you do that, you are destroying a part of that executable image. When, as someone who writes long-lived exploits and long-lived malware, we want to be able to have our code running indefinitely. We want to have the program continue its normal behavior, but also do malicious things on the side. We can overwrite parts of the heap. The problem is that the heap is non-executable on AMD 64 and ARM 64. We could overwrite a part of the stack, but again, the stack is also non-executable on AMD 64 and ARM 64. So we're really left with no options with injecting arbitrary code and getting that code to run. The procedure linkage table and global offset table is a lookup table of sorts. So when your application calls printf, for example, it will never directly call printf for dynamically loaded applications. Instead, it'll instruct the operating system's runtime linker to resolve the address of printf, because printf could be loaded anywhere in memory. And it'll stuff that resolved address, it'll cache it in the PLT GOT, the procedure linkage table, global offset table. And the next time your application calls printf, the resolution has taken place, and so it can use the entry in the PLT GOT to call printf. No further resolution needs to happen. There isn't any tooling for making PLT GOT redirection techniques possible. When you want to hijack a function, you simply overwrite the PLT GOT entry for that function. So if I wanted to write a malicious printf and have the application call my malicious printf, I would simply write my malicious printf's code in assembly or shell, or in shell code, or in a shared object that gets loaded. And then I would replace the lookup table, the cached version of the printf address, which is in the PLT GOT, with the address of my malicious printf. So that's where libhijack comes into play. Libhijack is a post-exploitation runtime process infection tool that aims to make injection of arbitrary code and the hijack of PLT GOT entries really easy. I originally wrote it for Linux way back in the day, around 2010, 2011. And I got really busy. It took a few years for me to develop libhijack in its current state. And I got really busy, and around 2013, 2014, I gave libhijack to a community called Soldier X. And Soldier X is an online security community filled with people of like minds, people who do reverse engineering, people who write exploits, and they're a really talented group of people. And I told him, hey, I don't have much free time anymore, so here's libhijack. You guys can now develop it and maintain it. And so I left for a few years. I left the project to SoldierX for a few years. And then last year, I was curious, would it work on FreeBSD anymore? And it did after a few changes. And so I picked up the project again, and I removed Linux support. And I ported it to ARM64. So now libhijack only supports FreeBSD, and it supports two architectures, AMD64 and ARM64. I removed Linux support because I haven't really used Linux in around a decade in any serious manner. BSD has really caught my interest, and I can pretty much do anything in FreeBSD or hardened BSD that I could do in Linux. So libhijack does not support Linux anymore. It relies heavily on the ELF headers. When you attach libhijack to the victim process, it will cache a lot of that ELF headers because we need to parse through the ELF headers to find the PLT GOT. So remember, we can't store our shellcode where the application is currently executing. We can't store our shellcode on the heap or on the stack. So what libhijack does is it forces the victim application to create a new memory mapping. That new memory mapping can be read-only or read and execute. It can have the write bit dropped. But we can write to it ourselves because we're using ptrace. And by using ptrace, the operating system gives us godlike permissions over the victim process. So we can inject our shellcode into the new memory allocation. The end goal for libhijack is to be able to inject anonymously full shared objects. If I'm an attacker and I'm attacking and my target is a web server, maybe running Apache, and I want to have Apache send me pcaps whenever I send it a special string, perhaps get/pcaps, HP/1.1. If I have libpcap opened in Apache via DLOpen, then if a sysadmin suspects the box has been compromised, then the sysadmin can go and look at the Apache process and see what files the Apache process has opened. And if the sysadmin sees libpcap opened within Apache, the sysadmin is immediately going to know that something has gone wrong. So what we want to do instead is anonymously inject libpcap, which means that libpcap is loaded within Apache, but it's not backed by a file. So that means that we can still sniff packets off the wire, use libpcap as normal, but the memory allocations for libpcap just look like a JIT or a heap. They look like normal memory, anonymous memory allocations. The system administrator might be fooled into thinking that nothing wrong has happened. That's the end goal of libhijack. We're not there yet. And libhijack does not support file back to memory mappings because of the stealth aspect of libhijack. We don't want to leave a trace on the file system. Now, FreeBSD has this really cool sandboxing framework called Capsicum. It is a capabilities framework that is extremely strong. It works on a per file descriptor basis. So when you open a file and create a file descriptor, you say, I can only read from this file, I can't write to it, I can only do certain types of operations. And when you enter capabilities mode, or cap mode for short, then the operating system expects you to have all of your file descriptors, all of your sockets, everything loaded and connected prior to entering capabilities mode. So once you enter capabilities mode, you have no access to the global namespace. So you can't call open, you cannot call socket or connect. You cannot call those syscalls anymore. So Capsicum is really a pain in the neck to use. I have a love-hate relationship because Capsicum expects you to have everything open already. And if you're trying to integrate Capsicum with a complex application like Tor, Tor will open sockets arbitrarily during its life cycle. And that is in direct conflict with Capsicum. And so using Capsicum takes a bit of work to do properly. One of the things that multiple FreeBSD developers have told me is that once you integrate with Capsicum, once you enter capabilities mode, attackers will never be able to gain arbitrary code execution. So tonight, that's what we're going to do. Most applications, when you're integrating with Capsicum, most applications will write wrappers around those global namespace functions. So open becomes sandbox underscore open. Socket becomes sandbox socket. And because of how difficult it is to use Capsicum properly, they've abstracted out helper functions to make using Capsicum easier. And for those of you who are a little bit older in the exploit authorship arena scene, you'll understand the phrase ret2 libc style attacks. That's when you write an exploit payload that returns into libc. I'm going to abuse that style of exploiting, and I'm going to do something similar with ret2 sandbox. And you could do something, if you're using the Casper abstraction library, you could return into that as well. Now, last year, when I was integrating Capsicum into Tor, I theorized that wrapper-style capsicumization requires ASLR, WXORX, and CFI at a bare minimum to be effective. And this year, Microsoft in Israel, at a presentation in their Israel labs, they noted CFI goes hand in hand with sandboxing. CFI is control flow integrity. It aims to prevent ROP and JOP and ROP variants. So right now, Tor officially only supports Linux sandboxing, so that's seccomp2, which uses eBPF filters, which whitelists syscalls. So what you do is you whitelist all the syscalls that you want to make, like open and socket and stat, and then after that, you can call those syscalls arbitrarily within the application's life cycle. When I integrated Capsicum, and this integration has not landed upstream yet in Tor. It's still in a private GitHub repo. What I did was I figured that I needed to create an IPC socket and fork off a child process. The child process would remain uncapsicumized, and the parent process, Tor itself, would enter capabilities mode. And I would write wrapper functions in the parent process, and those wrapper functions communicate with the uncapsicumized child, and they do file descriptor passing between the two, between the parent and the child. So the child can do those privileged operations on behalf of the parent, and they can pass file descriptors back and forth. So there's a context structure with a ton of function pointers. And so if you want to implement a new sandbox with Tor, you just implement a new context structure with your own custom wrapper functions. So in my shellcode, instead of calling dlopen directly, I'm going to call sandbox dlopen, or sandbox open, and then fdlopen on the resulting file descriptor. Because FreeBSD doesn't have ASLR and it does not have control flow integrity, we can hard code addresses and jump to them directly. We can do anything that we want within the context of this process. We can use copy and paste style exploitation. So if you're running Tor on FreeBSD, maybe a relay or maybe a client, maybe an exit node, and there's a vulnerability within Tor, then we can use the exact same exploit without having to modify it in the slightest against all of those vulnerable nodes. So what we'll do is we'll use libhijack to emulate a control flow hijack. We'll bypass Capsicum by mixing sandbox open with FDL open. So much for no arbitrary code execution. So what we're going to do is first call sandbox open. That will return us a file descriptor. Then we will call FDL open on the resulting file descriptor. That will load the malicious shared object. We will call DLSim, which will resolve our malicious function within that shared object. Then we will patch the PLT GOT with the address of our malicious function. Then within our malicious function, we can peek into the context structure and replace sandbox open, replace those function pointers with maybe malicious file function pointers. So this is when I'm going to do the demo, and let's hope that this works. Let's see, I'm going to try this. I need to plug a few things in. So I have here, this is a firewall that it's running Tor, and it's set up so that all of my network traffic from my laptop automatically gets routed through Tor. I don't have to configure my laptop to do even a single thing. I just have to connect it to the Torified network, and all of my traffic naturally just goes through Tor. So I'm going to try to mirror my screens here. Let's see if this works. All right, now we're going to bump up the font. Can you guys see that in the back? Okay, perfect. No, 251.1. All right, I'm going to do this. And actually, all right, so we can see that when I curl for my IP address, it took a while because it's going through Tor automatically. Now we see that 185, our IP address is 185.220.101.8, which is not the hotel's IP address. It is the Tor exit node. I'm going to stop Tor. Oops. There we go. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start Tor again, but as my local user. All right, so we see that Tor is running as PID 1793. We're going to take a look at the memory mappings for 1783, which is Tor. And we'll see that ASLR is not applied. Now if I grep for evil, because that's what my evil shared object is named, is libevilso.so, we can see that the evil shared object is not loaded. But what we're going to do is we are going to hijack, we're going to inject, the TACI option says inject a DL open shell code. That is assembly code that has been pre-compiled or pre-assembled. That shell code is going to load a special libevil shared object, and that's the TACS option. The TACF option specifies which function it's going to hook in the runtime, in the PLT GOT. So we're going to hook the receive function. It takes a few seconds because ptrace, the debugging facility, is a slow debugging facility. So we see down below, if, sorry, some heads might need to be chopped off, you'll see a special string, evilso, loaded. So if I do procstat again, and I grep for evil, we see now that libevilso is loaded. Now for a bit more fun, we're going to run the Bitcoin daemon. We're going to just sync the Bitcoin block ledger. And on my laptop, oh, I want to grab the PID. On my laptop, I'm going to connect to freebsd.org. I'm going to use netcat to connect to freebsd.org on port 80. And I'm going to send it a special string. This special string now instructs the now infected Tor process to go and infect another process. So I'm going to use an infected process to pivot and infect yet another one, which in this case is Bitcoin. We see that Tor is now running the infect command, and it outputted some debugging messages. And if I go over to bitcoind, we see that libevil has been loaded. So if I grep for evil in the PID, we see that evilso is loaded. So we pivoted from one process to another. We can inject libhijack into a victim process and use that to pivot and infect another. Now the Bitcoin block ledger is about 150 gigs in size, and this hard drive only has 15 gigs free, so I'm going to go ahead and Control-C that. And in fact, I'm going to do that too. All right. What's that? Oh. All right. So that was a non-capsicumized Tor process. That's just regular straight up Tor. And what I'm going to do now is infect a capsicumized Tor process. Now you see that underneath that log notice file line, you'll see that sandbox 1 is set. That means enable the sandbox, enable capsicum mode. So when I run the capsicumized Tor, we now see that there's two PIDs. a child process and a parent process. And of course, the parent process is PID 1877, and the child process is 1878 because FreeBSD does not randomize their PIDs. And so the PIDs are sequential. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to inject the same type of thing. We're going to inject an evil shared object into a capsicumized Tor. Now, because we're capsicumized, we are limited in what we can do. So this isn't the same evil shared object. It's a miniaturized version of it. It is a very limited version of the original evil shared object. And we're going to go ahead and hook receive again. And we see mini evil loaded. All right, so now I think that's it for libhijack. Back to the slides. All right, the MAC framework, Mandatory Access Control Framework. Oh, before I move on, does anyone have any questions about what I just demonstrated? I demonstrated using libhijack to infect a non-capsicumized process, and we were able to use that to pivot to another process, to use one infected process to infect another. We also demonstrated an arbitrary code execution, gaining arbitrary code execution in a capsicumized Tor process. So, intro to the MAC framework. The MAC framework really is just hooks in various parts of the kernel. So whenever you open a file or delete a file, or even call stat on a file, whenever you execute a binary, there are hooks for those things in the kernel. And so by utilizing those hooks, we can implement security measures within the kernel. And in fact, OS X and Juniper do that. OS X actually helped develop the MAC framework in FreeBSD. You think Apple doesn't really, a lot of people think Apple doesn't really contribute to open source, but that's not the case. Apple contributes a lot to open source. In conjunction with DARPA and the University of Cambridge in England, Apple helped develop the MAC framework. And they use it along with Juniper for executable signing. So they sign all of their executables. HardinBSD uses it to toggle exploit mitigations on a per application and per jail basis. In FreeBSD, there's something called UJIDFW, which is a user space file system firewall. So you can use the MAC framework to say these users or groups should be able to access only these parts of the file system in this way. You can implement a discretionary access control with MacBiba. So if you want to experience pain, go ahead and port SE Linux. The MAC framework really is complete enough for that. You probably wouldn't want to write rootkits using the MAC framework in production in the real world because there's an audit trail. You can use the MAC Rootkits to give you ideas of what you can do in the kernel, though. You can use MAC Rootkits to break out of jail. You can break out of capabilities mode. You can perform traditional privilege escalation attacks and overwrite other hooks of the MAC modules. One of the things that Windows taught us, though, is that if you need to gain trust in a system, just name your object something trustworthy, like ntdllsec.dll. And so if you did want to use the MAC framework, and for writing rootkits, you know, use a trustworthy name like super secure, awesome MAC thing. So because that name gets outputted into dmessage, so it gets it's auditable. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a demo of 3 things. We're going to do a jailbreak. A lot of people think, oh hey, Linux has Docker. That's awesome. That's a new thing. Containerization is great. It's new. It's wonderful. Well, FreeBSD has had containerization for almost 20 years now through its jail framework. And so what we're going to do is we're going to break out of the jail using a MAC Rootkit. Then what we're going to do is we're going to force all network daemons to bind on all interfaces regardless of how that daemon is configured. Even if it's configured to listen on localhost, so 127.0.0.1, we will force that daemon to bind to all interfaces. And the third demo for the MAC Rootkits is to disable capabilities mode. All right, so I have an existing jail called jail-01. It's already booted up, it's already running. In the host environment, if I look to see if I'm jailed, that 0 means that I'm not jailed. So I'm looking to see sysctl security.jail.jailed checks to see if I am in a jailed or in a containerized environment. So if I run that same command within the container, oops. That'll show me that by returning 1 that I am jailed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load the jailbreak rootkit. And I'm going to go ahead and check to see if within that jail, I'm jailed. So I just ran jexec space the name of the jail, which in this case is jail01, sysctl security.jail.jailed. And that shows now a value of 0 because the MAC rootkit is going through all the jails and setting the jailed property or the prison property to be the host. So if I go ahead and unload the jailbreak module and rerun that to check to see if we're jailed, we now see that we're jailed again. Now I have a test application for Capsicum. It accepts 1 argument, and that argument is an application that it's going to execute. So what I do is I open that application, then I enter capabilities mode, and then I execute that application. Under normal circumstances, that fails because once I enter capabilities mode, I no longer have access to the global namespace, which means I cannot open any new files. When the operating system attempts to run binls, it cannot open the runtime linker, which is libhijack ld-elf.so.1. Uncap. So now I've loaded the rootkit that uncapsicumizes applications. So now when I run the capsicumized application and try to run binls within it, I now can. So let's go ahead and unload the rootkit and retry running our application again. And we get an abort. We can no longer execute, access the global namespace. So now, remember that capsicumized Tor? Take another shot. I have it configured to listen on a SOX port on 127.0.0.1, port 9050. So if I run Tor then, I see that Tor is listening on 127.0.0.1, 9050. Now, if I load the bind all rootkit and rerun Tor, now we see that it's listening on all interfaces, port 9050. So we're gonna run, I just unloaded the bind all rootkit. We're gonna run Tor again. And we see that still now localhost. All right. So there's more stuff to do with the MAC Rootkit. I want to add more templates. There's more in the repo. The Rootkit repo is public. It's on SoldierX's GitHub. And I need to add more rootkit templates and tie them all into one all-inclusive module to show what you can do with those rootkits. With libhijack, I need to write that remote runtime linker. That is a really tough thing to do, to load shared objects in a remote process over ptrace. That's not an easy task. And I took a stab at it once around 2013, 2014, and it took me 6 months and I gave up. So I'm currently still doing more research in that area so that we can inject anonymously those shared objects. I'd like to port to more architectures like 32-bit Intel. ARM could be done. RISC-V would be fun. Power 9? Power 9 would be cool, and Power 8. Is there a Power 9 board out yet, dev board? I think that is the Raptor 2, I think, might be out. That could be Power 8, though. RISC-V would be really fun for libhijack. There's now a RISC-V dev board that costs $1,200, and I'm having a little bit of trouble right now convincing my wife to give me a $1,200 toy. I don't blame her at all, but that would be a lot of fun to port it to RISC-V. 64-bit, yep. FreeBSD on RISC-V, though, only supports a 39-bit address space, which is weird. FreeBSD first supported 32-bit RISC-V, then they went to 64-bit, then they went back down to 39-bit. I don't know why. So if someone wants to bring back Linux support, that'd be cool. I don't really run Linux, so I'm not really all too interested in it. So we've showed that libhijack is an effective post-exploitation tool that can even be used to emulate control flow hijacks. The MAC framework can be abused, but really It's fun and it shows you what you can do when writing a rootkit, some powerful things, and it makes writing bits and pieces of your rootkit pretty easy to do. But really, man, shouldn't really do that in the real world. To mitigate libhijack, disable unprivileged debugging. And that means that users can only debug processes that they themselves fork. So like GDB and LLDB can only attach to processes that they themselves fork. Implementing pax no exec would be an additional help, because then with pax no exec, you cannot write to non-writable memory allocations. Pax no exec applies to the ptrace boundary. Implementing pax ASLR would mean that you need to make your payloads dynamic, and it just adds another layer of complexity. You know, HardBSD has all of this stuff, so maybe just run that. To mitigate MAC Rootkits, you could disable MAC in the kernel, and you could disable the kernel interface entirely, kernel module loading interface entirely. So the code is on GitHub. So if you go to SoldierX's GitHub, you'll find both libhijack and the MAC Rootkits. And any questions, comments, heckling?
So I know for demonstration purposes, it makes sense to go ahead and show this binding all over. Is there any way to, like, because if a system administrator nets that, they're going to see that, right?
Right.
So is there any way to essentially like apply?
There is. So you can hook the ioctls. I believe those are grabbed via ioctls. When you create a special routing socket that will tell you you can get information about the routes and all that. You know, netstat under the hood uses ioctls with routing sockets. So you can hook those interfaces and mock the right output. Any other questions? All right, so because time was limited, I didn't really have much time to go dive into the code. So if anyone wants to sit through and go through the code with me, I'm here all weekend, and I'd love to show you how everything works under the hood. I can be reached on Twitter, on Mastodon, and a Torified Signal. So that's a lot of fun. Thank you very much.